Hi folks, welcome to the Chicago Burlington and Quincy Railroad and the Chicago and Northwestern Railway in Wyoming. Today is September 3rd, 2025, and this is Layout Update number 70. I'm Mark Pruitt, Accounts Receivable Clerk. That's an easy job since I seem to be pretty much a non-profit operation. There are very few accounts receivable. A lot happened in the month of August. I attended the North Platte, Nebraska train show where I sold nearly all the stuff I wanted to get rid of. I began working on a new loop for the Helix, then scrapped that plan, then unscrapped that plan again. I did a bit of work on the Cody branch, but that stopped dead near the middle of the month. The three musketeers, Dave, Steve, and Kevin, all came up to visit and help me work out how to make operating sessions a bit more structured, and boy did we come up with a lot of work for me. I spent hours analyzing and modifying the movement patterns of tank cars on the layout, and I began adding train order signals at each station on the line. The last few days I've been billing a dispatcher's office as part of the new operating scheme. As I mentioned, the first few days of August were spent at the North Platte, Nebraska train show with the Casper Club. The guy in the photo is Gene, one of our club members. All in all, it was a pretty good show. I sold most of the stuff I brought along. It's everything to the right of the thermos in the foreground of this picture. The club also sold most of the stuff we had to offer. It was a success for all of us. Once back from North Platte, I spent a couple days putting together a detailed system schematic for the layout in anticipation of a get-together to plan updates to my ops sessions. It lists all major stations and a couple of other locations on the layout. The large numbers give the length of the passing siding or longest industrial siding at each location, and the number in parentheses lists the number of 40-foot cars in a train that will fit in the clear on that siding. Until I created this schematic, I didn't realize just how complex a layout I was building. Early in the month, I also analyzed tank car movements on the layout. It didn't seem to me that tank cars were moving around the layout as they should be. The Standard Oil Refinery wasn't getting many cars to load in session after session. I have 37 tanks on the layout. What were they doing? I ran train after train in JMRI, not on the layout, and charted them in a spreadsheet to see what was happening. I color-coded the spreadsheet with the different locations the cars could be at on the layout. I found two big problems. First, a lot of the tank cars were bouncing back and forth between east and west staging, sometimes with an intermediate stop in Casper and more rarely in the Grable classification yards. This wasn't doing anyone any good. The second problem was that a lot of the cars spent most of their time in the Casper classification yard not moving at all. The cars moving across the layout were mostly empties that stayed that way, so the first thing I did was set JMRI so that the empty tank cars couldn't go into staging. That worked. Empty cars were no longer going to staging, but now they were just bouncing between Casper and Grable yards. I always built the through freights before I did the Casper local switcher. I tried reversing that and building the local switcher first, and that solved the problem of cars just moving back and forth between the yards. Now empties in Casper were going mostly to Standard Oil for loading, with a few going to Grable for later inclusion on the Thermopolis turn, where they would be dropped at Empire Oil for loading at that refinery. There are still a few adjustments to be made to tweak the flow a bit more, so I'll continue running trains in JMRI and making changes to work them out, but the overall flow should be much better now. It's going to take me half of forever to get all the cars on the layout into the spots JMRI thinks they're in after all the scenarios I've run. When I first built the Helix, it was supposed to be just a part of the Cody branch. As such, the maximum 17-car train length Mikados could handle climbing the Helix was just fine. When, due to my own poor planning, I had to route the east staging lead through the Helix, this limit became unacceptable. To compensate, I decided to use the 210-2 Santa Fe types for longer trains coming up from east staging. I even went so far as to shift the era of the layout about 10 years closer to the present and added early diesels to the layout. But I've never been completely satisfied with these solutions. The Santa Fe's and even the diesels are fine, but the restriction on train length with the Mikados just grated on me, so the second week in August I decided to do something about it. I took some careful measurements of the clearances in the Helix and on the lead down from Grable under Basin, and concluded that I could add another loop to the Helix and reduce the grade, hopefully enough to allow the Mikados to drag a full-length train up to Grable. On August 10th, I marked the new loop on a sheet of plywood and cut it out. I could start revising the Helix at any time. At this point, though, I stopped working on it for a few days. Since I had the sawhorses and saws out in the garage to cut the Helix, I also took a few hours and measured and cut the base for Husky Refinery in Cody. Here it is sitting on the Cody benchwork, awaiting installation. Then I extended the power bus further down the Cody branch. I took it past Vocation/Ralston and on to the apex of the turnback curve at the end of the peninsula. I haven't installed track feeders past Powell yet, but the bus wires and connection points are there when I get around to it. On August 17th, I installed the cork road bed at Vocation, then put in the track. I can't continue beyond this point until I build the west switch for the Vocation siding. Steve came up from Evanston on the 18th. Dave and Kevin were coming up on the 19th for a day of planning operation session changes for my layout, but since Steve has so far to travel, about 6 hours one way, he came up the day before. We discussed the Helix and decided to adjust the grade as much as possible without adding the new loop. We spent several hours doing that, with Steve inside the Helix and me working from the outside. All in all, we were able to reduce the Helix grade by just under 0.5%. That was enough to add about 3 cars to the train length the Mikados can pull up the grade. Over the last few days, I've decided to go ahead and add that extra loop to the Helix after all. That will improve the train length by another car or two. I'll do that job in the next few months, hopefully by the end of the year. Now we get to the operations refinement meeting. On August 19th, Dave and Kevin arrived, and the 4 of us spent most of the day at the kitchen table discussing different options to improve operating sessions on the layout. Prior to the meeting, Kevin spent a great deal of time doing things I should have done long ago, developing operating concepts and building a spreadsheet showing train locations on the layout at various points during an operating session. That last was a neat trick, considering that the schedule of trains was just a rough estimate, at best, on my part. While he was at it, Kevin also put together a train order log for a dispatcher and train order blanks for the operators to copy orders onto. Kevin spent a lot of hours doing all this work. He said he really enjoys it, and I'm really glad because it saved me a lot of time. Thanks, Kevin. After working most of the day on the 19th, we came up with these main changes to how operations on my layout will be done. Addition of a dispatcher to control train movements. No more stacking trains several deep waiting to get into Casper. Addition of train order forms so train crews would know what they were allowed to do. Addition of a phone/intercom system for operators to communicate with the dispatcher. addition of train order signals to the layout to tell operators when the dispatcher has orders for them. I had anticipated the addition of a communication system and train order signals and included them on the system schematic. A large version of this schematic, without the industry listings, will be mounted on a panel in the dispatcher's office, which I'll get into in a minute. During these discussions, we worked off the forms Kevin had provided. Dave's expertise as a retired engineer helped refine the forms and the overall concepts, while Steve provided insights and sanity checks along the way. I mostly stood there thinking, this will be a whole lot of work for me to incorporate this. We did have a bit of a disagreement at one point, the use of radios for operators to communicate with the dispatcher. Most layouts I've operated on use these little handheld walkie-talkies for that purpose. But most layouts I've operated on are much closer to the current day than the era I model. There's no doubt that these radios work well, but I really didn't want them. We even tried them out in my train room, and that just strengthened my opposition to them. I'll talk more about the alternatives in a minute. After Kevin and Dave left for the day, Steve and I began installing the red and green LEDs that will act as train order signals around the layout. Here they are installed in the fascia at Hudson. Wiring would come later. Through the evening, we worked our way around most of the layout. Where fascia isn't yet installed, we added small masonite panels to the layout to mount the signals to until fascia can be added. We ran out of LEDs, but we kept on through the evening adding the masonite panels. Steve left the next morning, and I continued adding the little masonite panels at train order spots around the layout. On the 21st, I began stringing wire for all these signals. I decided to use 3-conductor thermostat wire since I had a 500-foot roll of that on hand. But where were all those wires going? There was really only one place to put the dispatcher's office, below the stairs. We decided on that while everyone was here. I'll get into the dispatcher's office a bit more in a minute. Running the first train order signal wire took a couple of days. I had to lay on my back on a creeper and mount P-clamps to the underside of the benchwork all around the lower level of the layout from Grable to just past Casper. But by the 23rd, I had the first signal wired, at least on the receiving end. The LEDs I'm using are rated for 12 to 24 volts, so all I needed for testing the lines is an old train set power pack in the dispatcher's office connected up to the signal line. On the 25th, I tested out the first signal, the one for staging. Success! Both the green and the red LEDs lit up. With the P-clamps installed, it was much easier to run the wires for Casper, Douglas, and Grable. By the 27th, I had all those stations installed and tested. The next day, I did the upper level to Hudson and Lander. Then I started adding larger P-clamps to the lower level to run wires all the way around to the peninsulas. I'll probably need 2 sets of these larger clamps by the time I'm done, and I expect to have over 1,000 feet of wire run to operate them all. Now about the communication system. I looked at using a wireless intercom system as an alternative to the radios. I could get a 6-station set for around $150. While not ideal for a number of reasons, to me this was a much better choice than radios. Of course, the best and most prototypical option for me is a phone system. Kevin suggested Model Railroad Control Systems as one source, and Seth Newman there very graciously spec'd out a 5-phone system. Total cost held me back a bit though, somewhere around $1,000 by the time it was all in and functional. I thought I might be able to cobble something together that would work using YouTube how-to videos as a guide, So I searched eBay and found a guy selling vintage handsets. Perfect! I bought these 5 handsets for a total of $50. I still need to find a dispatcher's headset, but this is a good start. If I do decide to go with a system from Model Railroad Control Systems later, I can use these handsets as part of it. Now back to the dispatcher's office. Dave is going to take first shot at being the dispatcher, and as much fun as it would be to make him sit under the stairs in this condition, I couldn't quite bring myself to do that. I would have to make a proper office out of this area. On August 29th, I got started by adding 3/4-inch furring strips to the staircase stringers. By doing this, I wouldn't have to reroute that wire that runs across the stairs. In order to conserve elbow room in the already narrow space, I opted to use 1/4-inch plywood to line the walls and ceiling. On the 30th, I got the right-hand wall installed. On the last day of August, I got the left wall and the ceiling installed. The desk and panel will be at the far end of the side panels, so there was no need to install the walls and ceiling farther into the space than you see here. Once I get all the train order signal wires run, I'll continue working on this room. And that's it for August. September will be spent running wires for the train order signals and wiring them. I'll also hopefully be able to work on the phone system. I might get the frame installed for the dispatcher's panel and a temporary work surface as well. Beyond that, who knows? Maybe I'll take a break and build some freight cars, or that west switch at Vocation or something. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you next month. 2 months ago, we talked about the early months of 2008. Picking up from that point, in May and June, I extended the backdrop around the corner from Glenrock towards Casper and continued early work on scenery in Glenrock. Progress had slowed on the layout because I was elected to town council in late 2007. From July through October, I painted the backdrop at Glenrock. This taught me to avoid painting my own backdrops on all future layouts. Later in October, I added some trees and such to try and get a feel for how the area would look. Renovations on the house, town council, and of course work kept me pretty busy for the rest of 2008, so no progress was made on the layout through the rest of the year. In fact, that was pretty much the end of work on this layout completely. 2009 would see essentially no progress, and 2010 would see it dismantled. From early 2009 until 2012, I was on hiatus from the hobby because of other commitments and a disastrous move to South Carolina in 2010. So we'll pick up next month with the Allendale layout in late 2012 and early 2013. And that's the way it was in 2008. Thank you and good night from all of us at CB&Q News.